In this lesson, let's talk about shipping terms. These are going to be the most common terms that you hear when either speaking with your freight forwarder or your factory. And this not only will give you an understanding of what they all mean, but it's also good to be knowledgeable when discussing options with your supplier or your freight forwarder. There are a lot of different terms and acronyms that are used, but these are the important ones that you need to know before you get started. A lot of these terms relate to topics I'll cover in the rest of the videos in this module. This is a great video to refer back to if you're still unsure about what the different terms mean. We're going to talk about two different Incoterms. Now, if you look up Incoterms on Google, you'll probably find a chart that has like a dozen different Incoterms. However, the two that are commonly used are going to be FOB and EXW. This essentially designates who's responsible for the goods at which stage of their transport. The terms also designate who will pay certain fees, which has implications on your total freight costs. These terms come into play when you're discussing quotes and terms for your order with your supplier. Let's start with the Incoterm EXW, because it's a little bit easier to understand. EXW stands for Ex Works. What this means is the supplier does not have any shipping responsibility beyond providing the needed documents and making sure the goods are ready to be picked up from their warehouse at agreed upon date and time. You, as the buyer, will bear all the responsibility for the shipping process. Once the goods are finished, they will need to be picked up from the factory, and the supplier is no longer responsible for the goods once they leave their factory or leave their possession. When using EXW, your freight forwarder typically arranges for the goods to be picked up from the supplier and then transported to the port. You don't need to arrange this yourself. EXW quotes are going to be less expensive than FOB quotes since there's no extra responsibility to transport the goods to the port. Now, the other most common Incoterm is FOB, and this is the most popular Incoterm in general. This stands for free on board. FOB means the supplier is responsible for transporting the goods from their factory to the port. It's called FOB or free on board because free indicates that the supplier is free of responsibility once the goods are on board the vessel to transport the goods to you. Since the supplier is responsible for the goods until they're on board the vessel, this means the supplier is also responsible for paying certain export taxes, license fees, or anything else at the port. As a result, this is why FOB quotes are usually going to be a little bit higher price than EXW quotes. Quick tip for you guys, I actually like to ask for the quote from my factory in both EXW and FOB terms. Then what you can do is you can ask for a shipping quote from your freight forwarder for both EXW and FOB options, which just means that they would have to pick them up from the factory or from the port. And then you can do the math to see which one ends up being cheaper. Let's now talk about two different acronyms that you'll commonly hear used when speaking about duties. These are DDP and DDU. DDU stands for Delivery Duty Unpaid, and that means that you, as the buyer, are responsible for paying the duties once the goods arrive in the country. This will be handled through your freight forwarder or customs broker typically. Often, your freight forwarder pays the duties on your behalf, and you pay the duties to your freight forwarder, which is included in your final invoice for their services. Your goods won't be released from customs until the duties are paid. DDP, which stands for Delivery Duty Paid, means that the sender, which is usually your factory, is responsible for prepaying the duties for the shipment. This cost is often still your responsibility, but you pay the cost to your supplier when you pay for the order, and your supplier remits the payment to the customs authority during the shipping process. Of these two, DDU, or Delivery Duty Unpaid, is going to be more common. Let's now talk about a few acronyms that refer to the shipping methods, capacity, and carriers. For container shipments, you're going to hear FCL or LCL. These terms are used for sea shipments. FCL means full container load, and that your goods will fill the entire container. LCL means less than container load, and that means that your goods don't fill up the whole container, and therefore they're going to ship your goods in a container with other people's goods. After your goods arrive at the port and they're ready to be transported domestically, either by truck or air, maybe train, you'll often hear FTL, LTL, and SPD. FTL stands for full truckload, and that the whole truckload is dedicated just for your shipment. LTL means less than truckload, and your goods are only going to take up a part of the truck, and whoever else is using that trucking company, their goods will take up the rest of the truck. SPD means small parcel delivery. This is when you shipped boxes of goods individually that are not palletized. A lot of you guys are familiar with this. You probably just don't call it SPD because this is when you use services like UPS or FedEx or the Postal Service in the typical manner where you're just shipping one box. I'm going to be walking you through how to set up an LTL or an SPD shipment inside Seller Central in a video towards the end of this module. Now, I know we just went through a lot of acronyms, but don't worry, you can always just Google these different acronyms if you ever forget them. And all of the freight forwarders or anyone you come in contact with shipping your goods are usually more than happy to work with beginners and remind them what these different acronyms mean. Now, there are a few people that are going to be involved with this shipping process, and let's go over them. A freight forwarder is a service provider that arranges these different shipments. Think of them like a travel agent for freight. Freight forwarders are the experts who understand how the end-to-end shipment process works and will handle everything related to shipping for you for a fee. We highly recommend you use a freight forwarder. It is very difficult to do this without them. Oftentimes you'll hear Amazon sellers talk about 3PLs. This stands for third-party logistics. These are businesses that you can outsource some of the elements of your supply chain to. What's most common here is hiring 3PLs to provide storage or reshipping to Amazon, or taking the boxes out of the containers and putting them onto pallets, or repackaging or doing some of the prep. You'll also hear the term customs broker. This is a licensed logistics expert that moves your shipment through customs. They're responsible for ensuring that the shipment meets the different standards and regulations for the import or export of goods. They can assist with all the necessary documentation and duties and taxes and payments. And customs brokers are needed to get your goods through the customs process that you cannot clear yourself. Now, typically your freight forwarder is going to act or hire a customs broker on your behalf. So this typically isn't something that an Amazon seller would have to worry about or have to hire, but you will hear the term customs broker often. Now let's talk about a consignee and a consignor. Those are kind of weird words, aren't they? I might not even be saying them right, I don't know. But a consignee is the importer of record for your shipment. They are also usually responsible for paying the duties and any additional freight charges. This is typically going to be you or your company. Now, the consignor is the exporter of record for your shipment. This typically is going to be your supplier. Now, if you're already not confused enough, let's move on to some of the lingo that you'll commonly hear people in this industry speak about when we're referring to the different pieces of documentation. We have some example documents that we'll try to include in the resources below. A BOL is a bill of lading. The bill of lading is the master document used for just about everything involved in the shipping process, but mainly serves as a proof of the ownership of your goods. A CI, or a commercial invoice, is the legal document between the supplier and the customer, so your factory and you, that clearly describes the goods that are being sold and the value of the goods at cost. Essentially, how much you pay your supplier for the goods. They're also going to include the appropriate HS code, which we'll talk about more in a little bit, that corresponds with your respective goods. The commercial invoice is the one main document used by customs in determining your customs duties. A PL, or a packing list, is going to be a document that shows how the goods were packed for inspection or shipping purposes. You can kind of think of it like a checklist for the shipment. Now let's talk about HS or HTS codes. This stands for Harmonized System or Harmonized Tariff Schedule. This is a list that's developed by the World Customs Organization that outlines the codes used to classify and define all internationally traded goods. Now, essentially what this is this is just going to be a number that describes your goods that lets customs know how much they should be taxed or tariffed. You'll likely hear both of these terms used interchangeably, both HS or HTS, but they essentially mean the same thing. It's this code that's recognized worldwide to classify your goods. Now we have a few more things here to cover. And then at the end, I'll help you guys, because by now you're probably like, oh my gosh, what is all this crazy stuff that Greg's talking about? I don't know what any of this is and I'm overwhelmed, but don't be, I promise, you don't need to be. We're just trying to be thorough about teaching you about all these different acronyms or terms that you may not have heard about before. So duty, or the customs duty rate, is going to be the tariff or tax imposed on your goods when they're transported across international borders. Okay, so when you import something from a different country, your country may charge a certain tax or a duty on those goods. Lastly, let's talk about customs bonds. This is needed in the US and most other countries to import goods. In the US, you have a choice of either a single bond or an annual bond. A single bond only covers this one shipment, and typically, if you're doing 3 or 4 or 5 shipments per year, it makes sense to actually just get an annual bond, since they're typically 3 to 5 times the price of the single bond. When you're just starting out and you're trying to save money, feel free to get a single bond, but over time, if you start to take this business seriously and are doing lots of imports, an annual bond is going to make more sense. By now, you've probably heard a lot of these different acronyms. You think they're a little bit crazy. You're probably feeling overwhelmed and thinking, wow, international shipping is very difficult. But the truth of the matter is, by hiring a freight forwarder, they're essentially going to handle all these different items on your behalf and help hold your hand through the process. Most of this stuff you actually don't really need to know. We just want to educate you guys so that you feel better about speaking with the freight forwarder. But like I said, you typically just hire a freight forwarder. They handle a lot of this stuff for you, but you're going to hear them using a lot of these different terms. So now that you know the basic terms that are used during the shipping process, we'll move on to discuss the ins and outs of freight forwarders, custom brokers, and 3PLs.